afternoon, everyone, and welcome to LIBOR's Wednesday webinar. My name is Mary Ann Monteleone, Vice President of Professional Development for LIBOR. And today's session, our Wednesday webinar, is celebrating Black History Month with Tanya Luda Gordon on understanding implicit bias, conscious and unconscious. So we welcome Tanya. Before we turn it over to her, I want to introduce her formally, and then we'll turn the session over to Tanya. So Tanya Luda Gordon is the owner and CEO and president of Malleable Development, a New York State certified company founded by Tanya in 2006, which provides versatile, innovative, and high-quality professional services in the area of leadership training. Her company's success stems from Tanya's 35 years of experience, which is translated into her ability to quickly and effectively understand the client's unique needs. Tanya is also the executive director of New Millennium Development Services, Inc. for over 17 years, a community-based organization whose primary mission is the revitalization of communities through economic development. She is a graduate of Spelman College with a degree in English and political science. Her subject today, which is an area she has studied extensively, is understanding implicit bias, both conscious and unconscious. So once again, we welcome Tanya Luda Gordon.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted and excited about this opportunity to talk to you about this subject matter, implicit and unconscious bias, and how it impacts our daily decisions. Mary Ann, thank you so much for the invitation. I have had the pleasure of knowing Mary Ann for a few years now, and I am just really delighted that I have this opportunity to present to the LIBOR membership this subject matter. Now, the objective of today is to, one, clearly define implicit and unconscious bias, how it impacts our daily decisions, and how do we mitigate bias in our life. And so I think that this presentation will certainly bring value to everyone's life, just showing you the impact that bias has and how we can make this a useful tool, the training today, to help us as we navigate through our daily interaction with people. So now, first, let's talk about implicit bias versus unconscious bias. Now, although there's such similarity between both, there are distinct differences between the two. And that is what we're going to talk about for the next few moments. So now the definition of implicit bias. Implicit refers to bias that is implied but not said directly. Now, some of the most commonly five implicit bias characteristics are: implicit bias are pervasive. Everyone possesses them. Even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges. All of us are impacted by our life experiences. And although we have a rule of thumb for how we live our lives, what our belief system is, bias can have an impact on all of our decisions. And implicit and explicit biases are related, but distinct mental constructs. They are not mutually exclusive and may even reinforce each other. The implicit associations we hold do not necessarily align themselves with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances we would explicitly endorse. Also, we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group Through research, it has shown us that we can still hold implicit biases even against our own group. Oftentimes, when we look at this particular area, when I talk about our in group, I'm talking about comfort zone, right? And this is going to be constantly reinforced throughout today's workshop. That, our in group, it tends to be made up of our family, our friends, our neighbors, those that we share the same worship belief, those that we have a great sense of commonality with. But although that can be very favorable biases, there are also some negative biases that we might feel that belong to our own in group. And again, we're going to delve more into that, but I think it's important for us to understand and appreciate that just because we belong to a similar in group does not mean that there are not favorable and or negative biases towards our group. Implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we have formed can be gradually unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques. Now, let's look at unconscious bias. Unconscious bias is a term that describes the associations we hold outside our conscious awareness and control. Now, 5 of the most common characteristics of unconscious bias are: first, affinity bias. Affinity bias leads us to favor people who we feel have a connection or a similarity to us. Again, this is reinforced with those persons that belong to our group that we might share ethnicity, again, family, friends, neighbors, similar schools of thought and ideas. So in this realm, these are biases that are based on our commonality with people. Halo effect happens when you judge a person's qualities by other unrelated, usually physical qualities. For example, a sharply dressed coworker might be judged to be more competent than a coworker wearing a t-shirt. We've all heard the saying, dress for success. So that when you're in a work environment and you're aspiring to certain positions, you dress for the position you would like to be advanced to. Because the people that are in the decision-making capacity oftentimes will relate you physically with what they see and you being able to have the capacity to fulfill that role. That's a bias. It could be true, it might not be true. The person that dresses more casually might have a better capability to fulfill that function, which this can have an impact on what the decision maker ultimately does. But that gives you a sense of what a halo effect is. Now let's look at Horn's effect, which focuses on one particularly negative feature about a person, which clouds your view of their other qualities. For example, if a person uses a particular term or a phrase that you dislike, you may suddenly dislike everything else they have to say. And then finally, confirmation bias, which refers to the tendency to look for or favor information that confirms beliefs we already hold. Now, this is very important because if we already have a preconceived notion of, let's say, a particular group, and then something happens that reinforces that belief, that can have an impact on how you engage, interact, and even consider persons that are in other groups other than your own that I previously mentioned. So now let's look at section 1. What is implicit bias? So the first lesson that we're going to talk about is we want to have a foundational understanding, really, what is implicit bias and why does it have an impact on our life and the pursuit of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice in the decisions that we make. Now, during this session, we're going to talk about implicit bias referring to attitudes or stereotypes that can have a major impact on us understanding the actions that we take as well as decisions in an unconscious manner. So let's start to unpack this a little bit. So now, although it is often used in a negative context, the word bias in and of itself is really a neutral term. But as we have evolved, there tends to be a negative connotation that is associated with the word bias. But it's very important for everyone to understand that bias can be favorable or unfavorable. You can have a bias towards an object, a person, concept, a school of thought, an idea, which can be positive or negative. So what is important for us to understand here, the word bias, again, in and of itself, is really a neutral term. So now, there's an example that I want to help you understand in its simplest form, really how bias can be interpreted. So I'm going to use an example here with 3 colored balls. The red ball, I can have a favorable bias towards or preference. The blue ball, not favorable, and yellow is neutral. It doesn't really matter. Now, you ask yourself, why is this relevant in me trying to explain implicit bias? Because this is the essence of what bias is. It is having a preference or not a preference or neutrality towards, in this case, we're talking about colored balls, but in reality, we can project this into every facet of our life that we might have biases. And so what's important to know here, if you have a preference towards red, not blue, neutral towards yellow, certainly this doesn't make me a bad person, certainly, but simply it shows you my preferences. And there's no conscious control over these preferences. This is just my thought process. These are just my feelings. So again, use this example or keep this in mind as we continue the workshop so that you can see that this simple example can be utilized in any facet of the decisions that we make in dealing with people that might be considered in another group, a school of thought, an idea that might be different from our own. So when we say psychological processes are implicit or unconscious, we are really referring to something that operates outside of our conscious awareness, which means that this could be something that is really unbeknownst to each and every one of us. As I said in the beginning, all of us have biases. We are all a byproduct of our life experiences. But when we look at biases and the term implicit, oftentimes you're going to look at something from a perspective of good or bad. So if we're looking at our own end group, we're looking at our own comfort zone, because we consider ourselves the majority of us good, right? So those that are similar to us, we see them as good. Um, Sometimes what can happen if we're looking at another group, because we are looking at people from a perspective of a group as opposed to individuals, we might not look at them so favorably. We might look at them as bad based on biases that have impacted our life. And again, sometimes it's unbeknownst to us. And hopefully, through this workshop, it'll give us a chance to do some self inventory. So we can look at the man in the mirror and we can see what biases we have and how we can get a handle on them so we treat people from a fair and equitable standpoint. But it is very important for all of us to realize that we rely on implicit biases on how we efficiently function throughout the world. And so there is a place for it. There is certainly a need for it in our lives. We just want to make sure that in this space that we're doing what needs to be done from an appropriate perspective in how we're dealing with people, again, that might not be in our group, might not think the same way we do. So, by definition, implicit bias is nothing more than our evaluations or beliefs, whether positive or negative. They exist in us, and we must realize that they do so that we are aware of how we conduct ourselves in our day-to-day life. So the question is, if it is true about our biases that they might be hidden even unto ourselves, and they aren't necessarily bad, the question is, why are we spending time today talking about implicit bias and the impact it has on our life? And that is a very good question. Now we're going to even delve deeper into that. The reason it is important is because there are times when we will make decisions in dealing with people that might not be based on accurate information. We're basing it on stereotypes. We're basing it on past experiences. We're basing it, it sometimes can be purely based on emotionalism, but not facts. And when we find that the decisions that we're making day to day is not always based on accuracy when we're dealing with biases, we then can compromise the way we engage with people or perceive them. And it can have such an impact on our decisions, the perceptions we have of people, and behaviors that we demonstrate. Now, this makes it very challenging for us because there are times when our biases can be in direct conflict with our sense of fairness, our values, equity. Biases can be very deep-seated in our mind. And again, I said it's based on life experiences. And when we're dealing with this, we might feel that we have a certain set of guidelines that we live our life by, that we believe in, that we raise our children to believe in, that we interact day to day, both in our personal and professional life. But sometimes biases can be in direct conflict with that. And so when we find ourselves in this situation, it can create a real world barrier to equity and opportunity for those that our decisions are having an impact on. Now, with this application, it's important for us to understand that biases sometimes, as I said before, might not align with our good intentions or even our explicit beliefs. So to summarize implicit bias, it refers to our attitudes and stereotypes that we might hold outside of our conscious awareness. However, it can still have an impact on those that we project this bias towards, even though we might not be aware of it. Because when we refer to those beliefs that we are aware of, but that we conceal or suppress in an effort to appear non-biased. Now, let's go back to the exercise we did earlier with the color balls. Red, I had a preference towards it. I had a positive bias towards the red. The blue, I had a negative bias. So this, again, is in its simplest form, me helping you understand biases. Now, in this case, it's innocent. It doesn't have an impact just beyond our preferences. But again, maintain this exercise in your mind as we continue on the workshop, because it helps us really have an understanding of implicit bias and how it can impact our life and those that we interact with when you're looking again at a person, an idea, or a concept. Now, when we use the word stereotype, it refers to beliefs that are mentally associated with a given category. So let's look at this. For an example, people often stereotype Asians as being good in math. Men tend to be associated with being in the workplace more than women. Let me give you an example. A few days ago, I had the opportunity to attend a Libby event, and overwhelmingly, there were men. And there were also women in the audience, but I had to evaluate my own personal biases that I see on TV, in the movies that I read, and my life experiences. I interpreted in my mind that the overwhelming amount of men that were present probably were the business owners, probably the decision makers, and that women probably were more in a supportive role. That's biases. And I was not basing that on any fact. I had not surveyed the audience. I didn't know that. The overwhelming amount of the women present could have been business owners. It could have been the total reverse, that a significant amount of men were in supportive roles. But I want you to understand how bias comes into play. This was based on socialization, how we internalize the roles of men and women in the workplace. Now, to take it a little further, is you can have this perception in your mind, but then how does it impact you in how you interact and engage with people based on information that you have no proof of it being accurate? So at this point, again, you might be asking yourself, why is the topic of implicit bias worth our time, our consideration? There are so many other issues that can impact pursuit of equity and fairness. Implicit bias is merely another tool that we use to have a greater understanding on how conscious commitments to fairness and equity can be disrupted. More importantly, implicit bias doesn't take away from addressing explicit or direct instances of discrimination. In fact, the effects of implicit and explicit and institutional bias are informed by and contribute to each other. Now we want to go into section 2, where we will delve into unconscious bias and how that has an impact on our lives. Unconscious biases are biases that everyone has, and it lives in the dark recesses of the human brain. So in this section, we're going to talk about ideas and techniques for defining different unconscious biases that are very commonplace today in our lives. The objectives that we hope to address in this section is to demonstrate some of the most commonly known unconscious biases. We want to be able to identify these biases and to be able to come from and how they are ingrained in our decision making. We're going to call them triggers. And then we want to successfully confront unconscious bias individually. So what is unconscious bias? To fully understand and appreciate this subject matter, first we have to fully define it. And then we need to also understand the causes and the effects, and also how to mitigate it so that we can be more conscious in the decisions that we make in regard to this subject matter in our lives. The definition: unconscious bias is usually thought of as social stereotypes and is more common than conscious bias. Now, these biases, as I said before, are deeply rooted in the human brain. We constantly are collecting information, data, and we categorize it in our mind. So for instance, you can see something on TV today, collect it, categorize it in regard to people that you know or you don't know, groups. And so oftentimes when we're gathering data, we're interpreting it, we're categorizing it, but we're also making a decision if it's good or bad. As I stated earlier, in our comfort zone, people that we feel are similar to ourselves, we have a commonality with them, whether they are family, friends, neighbors, people we worship with, people that we just enjoy being in company because of our similar points of view. We're going to see them as good because most of us see ourselves as good. But when we're looking at other groups of persons, whether they're different from us from an ethnicity standpoint, they worship different from us, they might have different points of view regarding ideas, we might not see them in a positive light. This is where we have to be very thoughtful and mindful, because we don't want to judge people based on necessarily past experiences or purely emotionalism. We want to base it on facts. But it's very important that we understand right here how it works is how we categorize people in a good category or a bad category in our mind. Let's look at the impact that this could possibly have. So in the work environment, if there is a mindset that allows bias to influence the way we do business, it can become negative and toxic. And people that can bring great value to our organization, if they become aware of these attitudes and lack of diversity, might move on to another place of employment, but we have missed out on the great capabilities that they have and the great value they can bring to our organization. I mentioned earlier triggers. Okay, so when we're dealing with biases, unconscious biases, past experiences, you could have a bad experience that occurred regarding a particular person. And because of that bad experience, that can color the thought process you have regarding a group of people just because of that past experience. The environment in which a child is raised can have a major impact on their biases. And then educational system. I remember at the age of 8, my parents put me in a private school. The private school, the children were not used to engaging with someone different from themselves. And it was at that time a challenging experience for myself and for them. They had little to no experience, as I said, with engaging with someone different from them. But if I allowed myself to make a bias against a group of people because of what I experienced from, let's say, 3rd to 6th grade, would not have served me well of those that I engaged with in the future, because some of those same children I had an opportunity to go to school with in high school from 11th to 12th grade. And it was a totally different experience. They obviously had their worldview had changed significantly. They were socialized at that point in time in their life where they engaged with persons from several different groups, and they had more of a spirit of inclusiveness. And so in this case, what my biases could have been in my earlier years totally changed once I got older and I had an opportunity to enjoy that experience with my classmates at that time in my life. And that is why it is so important that we always understand that there are triggers in our life, but we want to try to maintain an open mind towards whatever the experience is, because we might have another experience that totally contradicts that and brings so much joy and happiness and fullness to our lives. Now, there are many different types of biases, and we're going to talk about them now. Affinity, halo, effect, attribution, and confirmation that we spoke briefly about earlier in this presentation. Affinity bias can cause a person to gravitate more towards people that share their interests, reside in their same neighborhood, or attended the same school, as I mentioned before. Affinity bias is based on a commonality that you have with people. So this is a case of a positive bias because you feel a kinship, you feel an association, you feel a bond, you feel a comfort zone in this space. Halo effect is a good example of halo bias, is when an employer, let's say, only hires graduates from specific schools. So let's say an employer only wants to hire in certain levels of management, Ivy League persons. Now, this bias can undermine another person's opportunity that might have more capabilities in this particular role. But again, because of this bias, one might feel that just by virtue of one's educational background alone means that they will serve better in this capacity, which does not always necessarily have to be accurate. Again, we keep reinforcing biases that are not based on facts, but past experiences and emotional. Attribution bias is judging another person before knowing the facts. This is done so often. People will meet a person, they don't know the facts about the person, but again, because of biases that might exist, whether knowingly or unknowingly, and because of that, it can have a negative impact on how they engage and decisions that they make on dealing with those persons. Confirmation bias. Now, this is best really being used with one's belief or ideas to judge another person. This type of bias can occur, let's say, when a manager is forming an opinion of, let's say, an applicant purely based on that person's name. They don't know them. They have not given themselves an opportunity to get to know them based on facts, but they're going to feel based on their name in their mind. You remember I said we collect information, we categorize it. Well, in this case, it's not based on facts. It's just based on a name and feeling that this person belongs to a certain group. And depending on whatever our bias is towards that group, is how we will perceive that person. Now, let's look at section 4, how to reduce bias. Sometimes we feel that this problem of bias is so enormous in the world. What can I possibly do to address this problem? What can I do to reduce bias in my world, in my space? And that is a very important question because it really starts with us as individuals and what decisions we make to mitigate bias. We might not be able to directly impact our entire community, but if each of us individually embraces understanding and appreciating bias, even in ourselves, and then taking on the call to action, what can I do in my personal life to mitigate bias? That is where it starts. And then this way, it doesn't appear to be such an overwhelming endeavor. Mitigating unwanted effects of bias. This is a perfect opportunity for us to begin to look at how we can be more inclusive and equitable and just with people that we engage with. Now, each of us has the ability, the power to be able to align our good intentions with our desired outcomes. So now let's look for the next few moments on how do we do this? First, we want to become consciously aware of our own biases. You know, we have to take self-inventory. I gave you an example of myself, of going to an event and how I, because of my socialization biases, interpreted that the men were probably the majority in positions of leadership at their company, decision making. Women might possibly be in a supportive role, but I had to immediately check myself. And this is what we're talking about. You need to become consciously aware of your own biases. And this is important because until you really face it head on, it is difficult to address a problem without knowing it really exists. When we feel ill, we go to a doctor, whether we think it's the flu or something of even a serious nature. We address the problem. Well, dealing with bias is the same thing. In this case, we can take self-inventory on our own, in our own personal space. Now, after we're more familiar with our own biases, then we can practice what I call mindfulness and perspective taking. Well, what does that really mean? That means that we take the time to gather accurate information before we make decisions on how we are going to engage with a person or make decisions on what will impact one's life that can undermine our treating them in a just and equitable way. And so research has shown us that the most effective ways of increasing our cognitive control is through using these two tools, becoming more mindful and perspective taking, to gather as much information that is accurate, that is factual, when we're making decisions. So mindfulness can improve our ability to fully focus on the present, be aware of what's happening to us and how others may also be experiencing the world, because their world experience, their worldview can be totally different from ours. But that sense of mindfulness in reducing bias will help us to be fair and just when we're dealing with people. Mindfulness can also help us to ensure that our associations with persons that might be different is aligned with our belief systems of being fair and just. Now, intergroup is very important. If you're willing to expand beyond your comfort zone and to be able to engage with people, again, that might be different ethnicity, might have different points of view, you will find that this brings such value to your life, because as you get to know people on a one-on-one, and sometimes you're going to find that persons who they are is in direct conflict with how you feel a group is. And that is why it is so important that we take the time to try to get to know people that are different from ourselves, so that we can get the benefit of adding those additional colors to our life, just different points of view, which can bring so much value to us and will have a direct impact on how we treat people. Finally, as we said, when you're exposed to counter stereotypical examples, that can challenge your implicit biases. This can be an opportunity for you to be able to combat directly implicit biases that might exist in the recesses of your mind, but to be successful with being able to be fair and just based on individual you're dealing with, as opposed to looking at them as a group. So we begin to question stereotypes that we have all learned throughout our lives, to understand that an entire group of people cannot be assumed to be the same. People are different. They might have some similarities, but you want to get in the habit of dealing with people on a one-on-one basis dealing with facts. Typically, we tend to look at people that belong to our group within our comfort zone as individuals. But when we look at people that belong to other groups as homogeneous. So, an example here I want to ask you to embrace is to change that thinking. The brain relies on cognitive shortcuts, and this can provide stereotypes. Again, let's go back to the triggers that we talked about, our life experiences, educational experiences, all of these, or how we were brought up. All of these can have an impact on our view towards stereotyping persons. But when we begin to engage with people, it can directly allow us to broaden our thought process. So in conclusion, I hope that you have found this experience engaging and enriching and even a bit challenging. But there's a call to action for all of us to be able to address the biases that exist in our lives, and then what we can do to disrupt these undesirable biases so that the decisions that we make and that the impact that we individually can positively have on our society can be based on facts, not erroneous information. So we move closer to being individuals that we want to be and part of a society that values all and enriches our lives. Now I'm just going to go over some of the most frequently asked questions that will really summarize the presentation of today. How do biases affect us? Bias tendencies can also affect our professional lives. They can influence actions and decisions, such as how we interact with persons of a particular group, what advice we consider, and again, biased awareness can help you make fair, professional, and personal decisions. How do you examine your own biases? Introspection. Explore and identify your own prejudices by taking implicit association tests or through other means of self-analysis. Mindfulness. Since you're more likely to give into your biases when you're under pressure, practice ways to reduce stress and increase and focus mindfulness. How does bias develop? Bias is acquired at a young age, often as a result of one's upbringing. This unconscious bias becomes problematic when it causes an individual or a group to treat others poorly as a result of their gender, ethnicity, race, or other factors. And finally, the takeaway from today is how to reduce bias. Focus on seeing people as individuals, not so much belonging to a group. Work on consciously challenging your stereotypes. Take time to pause and reflect on where you are and your own personal biases. Adjust your perspective. Be open-minded. Be willing to accept people and to get to know them on their own merit. Increase your exposure. Be willing to move beyond your comfort zone and get to know people that look different from you, might have a different worship experience than yourself, have different attitudes, different belief systems. It will bring so much more value to your life. And finally, practice mindfulness when you find yourself in a decision-making position. Always think from a mindfulness perspective. Look for the facts when you're looking to make decisions, that are going to have an impact on your life as well as others that you engage with. Thank you so much for your time. I have really enjoyed it, spending the last moments with you, and now I'm happy to turn it back over to Marianne. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tanya. We did have a question, but I think, and I responded by saying that I think you did answer it. How can we change our thinking at the grassroots level? And I think your summary did reflect that, focus on seeing people as individuals, work on consciously changing your stereotypes, adjust your perspective, increase your exposure, practice mindfulness. I took notes.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And somebody also asked, is bias, can it be confused with prejudice? Do you want to comment on that?
So bias, there is and there can be certainly an intersection of both of those terms, but bias, it deals with sometimes knowing and not knowing that it exists. That example, it goes back to with the colored balls, preferences, operating in our comfort zone, looking at people that don't necessarily belong to our group. Prejudice is more conscious behavior. It is when one has made a determination on a person, and then they act on that, which again, there are similarities, there are certain intersection, but what we're talking about today is how to engage with our own biases, again, that we all have, and we do have prejudices also, but prejudices is more conscious behavior and how you determine and make decisions on how you deal with people in a forthright way in your mind, and it is demonstrated through your actions.
Yeah, great response, way to tell the difference, and thank you for that. Tanya was gracious enough to allow us to record this, and if you want to hear this again or share it, it's at lirealtor.com under Education Wednesday webinars, and it will be up there in about a day, and you can listen in again. We also look forward to your return. She's an approved New York State continuing education instructor, and we worked throughout COVID to get her approved, and I'm looking forward to working with you again. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. Thank you. And thank you to the LIBOR members. I certainly enjoyed today.
Yes, so did we. Have a good week.
You also. Bye-bye now.
Bye all.